Welcome back to the Apiary, a knitting podcast. If we haven't met yet, I'm Lauren Rad. I'm a knitting pattern designer with a focus on accessories, especially socks. And I'm here today with my friend Aimee, who is one of the best garment designers I know, and who also has an online yarn shop. Between the two of us, we're exposed to a pretty good portion of the knitting design world. So this seemed like a good opportunity to talk about a perennial hot button issue among designers: design copying. So, Aimee, what's your sense of kind of the design landscape generally, and how big of a problem design copying actually is?
I've designed over 45 patterns now. My SKU is like way in the high 40s, my SKU count. And most of them garments. And I can say there's only been one time where I feel like somebody may have copied off of me, but I don't feel like it was that valid because they just reverse engineered what I did. So I think I guess my stance, not to end this conversation and have a opinion that's a conversation ender, but I just don't think it's that big a
I
deal.
mean, genuinely, that's my sense too. There may have been a time or two where somebody released a pattern and it looked similar to something I had done not that long
Mhm.
ago. But there were so many other possible explanations for what could have gone into that. I don't even have any way of knowing that they actually saw the pattern I released, especially with the
Mhm.
increasing unreliability of social media algorithms.
Mhm.
I could make 10 posts about a new upcoming release, and somebody who follows me might not see any of them, depending on how often they're online.
So I will say that while maybe it's due to kind of like my more laid back, relaxed nature, but while I've only thought one time, like, oh, is that person copying me? I've been accused several times.
Oy.
So I feel like I might have like a slightly different viewpoint than you do just because I've been accused enough and some of my patterns have gone kind of semi-viral and widely shared. And I can confidently say neither of those times I ever saw the original pattern.
I feel like
Yeah.
that's really
Hmm.
common. Most of the time, I think when someone is accusing someone else of copying their designs, the other person comes back and they say, I didn't even know this other pattern existed.
Yeah. And in fact, I actually go out of my way not to browse Ravelry pretty much ever unless I'm specifically doing competitive research. And I don't scroll on Instagram very much. Like for particularly the larger designers out there, I actually mute them even if I follow them, just because I don't want to even by accident have their design seep into my brain. So I actually don't know what's happening out in the design world at all, other than what people directly tell me in DMs and things like that.
I do the same thing actually. I want to say maybe about 5, 6 years ago, I went through my following list and I unfollowed a lot of people, not because I don't like their work, not because I don't like them as people, but because I wanted to make sure that I was not too closely ingesting their ideas and then
Mhm.
regurgitating them even unintentionally in my own projects. The designers that I do tend to follow more tend to be designers who design the kind of stuff I don't design.
Now, I know we've talked about this before, but I feel like it's worth touching on for our audience again. Like, you're not copying somebody else's work if it's just a design inspiration. So we might have some moral gray areas, but honestly, if you can reverse engineer somebody's work just from looking at a picture of it, I would not consider that copying. I wonder if it even matters in the end because we all have such different creative processes. Like, I'll shamelessly try to dupe a ready to wear sweater, something that's really trendy right now, and I will absolutely be like, let me throw some cables on a construction like this and see what happens. But by the time I'm done, it doesn't really even look anything like the original. So I feel like it's actually kind of hard to, I don't know, at least for me, it would be very difficult for me to copy something and then not put like an entirely different take on it.
Same. I think even if I'm getting inspiration from somewhere, I'm never drawing inspiration from a single source. So
Yes.
usually, when I am starting a new design, I'll be thinking about, okay, what textures do I like? Do I want to do lace in this pattern? Do I want to do cables in this pattern? Do I want chunky cables? Do I want really delicate cables? And then what other things is that reminding me of? So like if I'm doing a bunch of really delicate cables, I often think of like the really intricate stone carving on medieval churches. And if I'm doing a lot
Ah.
of lace work, I'm thinking about and looking at, Edwardian undergarments. Their underwear was so
Mhm.
pretty back then. I see a lot of newer designers worrying about like, how can I check all 80 million patterns on the internet to make
Mhm,
sure that the thing I'm designing hasn't been done
mhm.
before? And I say, you don't. You can't. It's functionally and literally impossible. What you can do is do the design that your heart is telling you that you want to design, put your spin on it, write the pattern in the way you write your pattern, and it will speak to the people it needs to speak to.
I do think that maybe in this conversation, there's also room for designers who have very different styles of artistry. Like, for example, for me, my designs are very practical. They're really, I approach them like they're ready to wear designs. And as most of our viewers probably know, ready to wear designs copy and inspire each other all the time. Things trickle down. There's that like famous monologue with Meryl Streep in The Devil Wears Prada about how that cerulean sweater was chosen for you in this very room. And then like Valentino showed the cerulean blue, and then it eventually trickled
Love
down to
that
the
scene.
sad Nordstrom rack that you got this sweater. Like that whole monologue I feel like is very representative of what we're talking about here is that these ideas get circulated and everybody has a different customer base. Now, in my case, I don't really feel like somebody who's copying me would really be taking anything from me because my customers know who I am. They know that my garments work. They know that it's going to fit them and that it's going to be easy to style. All of those things, I think those are those like intangible things that we're selling that are not necessarily like on the page of it's not on the product page, but there's these feelings and these practical considerations that we're selling beyond that looks so cute on the rack. I want that.
I feel similarly. I feel for me like my designs are a doorway into a world. And so even
Mhm,
if somebody were to directly copy stitch by stitch one of my sock patterns, all of the other parts that go with that would be missing. And the way that I write my patterns would be missing. And so, for people
mhm,
who are used to how I write my patterns, for people who find that my pattern writing style works really well for them and their brain and how they
mhm,
like to take in information, even if somebody else were to recreate that sock pattern, their pattern writing style would be different. I feel
mhm.
like this is probably a good point to mention that, when we talk about design copying, we do talk about it as a different thing from somebody taking the PDF of your pattern and popping it up for,
Or even copy
sale
and
or for free
pasting
elsewhere.
sections of it.
Mhm. That's different. That's a different consideration. We're talking more
Mhm.
about the aesthetic parts of the design process and what the finished item looks like. And that is, boy, that's a real subjective question anyway.
I do think it's kind of like a little bit of a hubris to say that I independently came up with a thing that literally no one else on the planet has ever thought of before. There's no way like we spontaneously invented writing in like 300 different cultures or something like that. Like, it just maybe not 300, dozens of cultures like spontaneously invented writing. So, like there's no innovation under the sun that somebody else hasn't at least thought of.
So I think especially in the design world, when we're talking about, there's only so many ways to shape a wearable garment. You can do it top down, you
Yeah.
can do bottom up, you can do a few different shoulder constructions, but at some point you run out of shapes. Same thing with socks, right? You have your cuff, your leg, your heel, your foot, your toe, and you can come up with different ways to approach those, but there's only so much you can do within that small little creation there. And I think the fact that we are locked into those predetermined shapes makes it even harder to get too unique. So, several years ago, I was working on a pair of socks to release, and it was a pair of socks with a lacy leaf panel down the front and some little tiny cables on each side, and the same panel down the back. And just as I think I was finishing up the test knit or getting ready to start the test knit, Aimee posted a pattern on Instagram saying coming
Like a test
soon.
call. Yeah.
Yeah, and it was a pair of socks with a lacy leaf panel down the front. And I started cracking up because Aimee and I are friends, obviously, and have been for a very long time. And we had had no conversations about these socks. We had no idea the other one was doing this. And so I messaged Aimee and I said, "So this is really funny." And I sent a picture of the sock that I had been working on. And what do you remember of this conversation?
I remember you being like, "Are you cool with this? I'm cool with this. Okay, yeah, we're cool." Like we were just, it
Yeah.
just that's sometimes that's all it takes. I've also had
Yes.
instances where somebody was like, talking to another designer and being like, "I think Amy sure copied you." And then she reached out and was like, "I don't think you copied me. Can I just tell them that?" And then she would say, like, "I don't think she copied me." And honestly, like, she even pointed out the different features, like the different it was a mitten and it had like a convertible flap. So then she
Oh
pointed
yeah.
out that the flap was different and that it came in a different variety of sizes and a multitude of views. Hers had color work, didn't have color work, but it had the same stitch pattern.
Mm-hmm.
So she was like, if this gives people more choices, it's not really the same as mine. It gives people choices on somebody else interpreting the stitch pattern that neither of us came up with. So I think that's sometimes that's all it takes. Like it's just for designers to take a minute, take a pause, and talk to each other.
That brings up a really good point, which is a lot of us are using stitch dictionaries, at least as a
Mm-hmm.
jumping off point. And a lot of us
Mm-hmm.
are using the same stitch dictionaries. There are certain designers who love the same stitch dictionaries and will pull the same stitch pattern from the stitch dictionary and apply it to the same item. And that doesn't mean that either of us copied each other. It means we both got inspiration from the same starting point. And so I think, when designers have a little bit of humility about the fact that we didn't invent the stitch pattern, that also helps eliminate, I think, potential sources of conflict that don't need to be conflict.
So I want to ask you a question, Lauren, which is, do you credit when you use something from a dictionary, particularly one that's really well known, like the Japanese Stitch Bible or one of Nora Gunn's beautiful cable dictionaries? Do you credit? Because I sometimes do when I feel that it's a notable one that I wouldn't have seen elsewhere.
So usually when I use stitch dictionaries, because of the likelihood that somebody else is using that same stitch dictionary, I don't use the same stitch pattern. I look at it for
Ah,
inspiration and then I tweak it. I'm always looking at a stitch dictionary and saying, okay, this is pretty. What can I do to modify it and make it my own? So that helps kind of,
that's so interesting because I will
yeah.
just lift entire stitch patterns out of a stitch dictionary and turn it into a garment, but I'll credit it if I feel that that person originally created that stitch dictionary. And of course, in many stitch dictionaries, the author says use it.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, I feel like there are kind of like not legal, but moral nuances of whether we choose to acknowledge our inspirations or not.
I think if you are not deeply embedded in the knitting world, or if you haven't been here for very long, you don't realize how certain design themes echo through time.
Mhm.
And so, two patterns that may not actually be that similar might look more similar to you if you haven't seen 5,000 patterns. If you've only seen 24 patterns and you see two, round yoked sweaters with color work on it, you're going to go, oh, that's the same pattern. And then once you've been in the knitting world for a long time, you go, oh, there are literally thousands of round yoke sweaters with color work on the yokes.
I feel like even just the tone in which we're presenting something makes clear that it's a separate entity even before we download and look at the patterns and compare them side to side. Of course, if we download the patterns and compare them side to side and they're word for word the same, that's a different story. But I feel like we can assume goodwill in a lot of cases.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Maybe I'm naive about that, but I assume goodwill.
No, I think because there is a relatively elevated expectation of good behavior in the knitting world, the vast majority of designers that I've had any contact with really do care about doing their work well and running a good business. We may not always agree about how to do that, but there is always this undercurrent of trying to be good while doing that work. There are, of course, bad actors out there, but I think they're the minority. So I don't think it's naive to assume the best possible scenario in these cases because most of the time that is the actual situation. In terms of thinking about kind of the future of design work and,
Mhm.
design copying issues, there are more and more patterns being released all the time. Do you have any thoughts on what a new designer should keep in mind when they start looking at these issues?
Maybe this is specific to me as a garment designer, but um, I would say to new designers, keep your eyes on your own work, which we all should be doing anyway, and focus on what your customer wants because, you can copy till the cows come home or take inspiration almost directly without modification till the cows come home. But if it doesn't serve your customer, then nobody's going to buy it.
I think that's a great final note for this episode. So, Thank you for being here, Aimee. I'm really looking forward to having more chats with you in the future. If you're just joining us, we did an episode recently over on Aimee's channel as well, and we are planning to do these on a kind of regular basis, going back and forth between our two YouTube channels. So make sure to give a subscribe to Aimee's channel as well. I will tag Aimee in the description below. And thank you for being here. We'll see you next time.
See you next time.